In 1889, in a small Texas courtroom, a dying man's last words became the first time this word was ever written down. It got a man shot. It got a soldier sentenced to 10 years of hard labor. It got a comedian arrested on a public stage in front of a live audience. And somehow, across 137 years, it went from the deadliest insult in the English language to a badge of honor. This is the story of one word, and it is far stranger than you think. Words are not born. They are forged. In courtrooms, in barracks, in smoky jazz clubs at 2 in the morning, in prison cells, in recording booths, on movie sets, under bright lights. Most words fade so quietly into a language that no one remembers when they arrived. This word is different. This word left a paper trail. Court records, court-martial documents, newspaper clippings, half-censored with dashes because no one dared print it whole. Obscenity trials that made it to the highest levels of the American legal system. For over a century, Motherf has been tracked, feared, banned, celebrated, and rewritten, not by accident, but because every generation that touched it needed it to mean something different. Tonight, we are going back to where it started. Not to shock you, to show you how a single compound of 2 ordinary English words, mother and a verb for violence and sex, became one of the most load-bearing words in American culture. Because behind every era of this word is a story about power. Who has it? Who's denied it? And who decided to take the most forbidden word available and turn it into their own? Texas, 1889. A courtroom, the kind with high windows and slow ceiling fans, the air thick with heat and formality. The case is Levy versus State, and on the stand, witnesses are being asked to recount, as precisely as the law demands, the final words spoken between 2 men before one of them ended up dead. The victim, according to sworn testimony, turned to his eventual killer and called him a goddamned bastardly son of a... The court stenographer wrote most of it down, but even inside a formal legal proceeding, in front of a judge, the word itself could not be fully printed. It appears with a dash where the middle should be. Motherf, too dangerous for ink, even in a murder trial. Think about that for a moment. This wasn't slang shouted in the street and forgotten. This was a phrase serious enough, insulting enough, that a defense attorney would later argue it as partial justification for a killing. In 1889, America, calling a man this word was not casual. It was closer to a declaration of war, and it worked its way into the written record of American law almost by accident, because a man used it right before he died, and the court had no choice but to acknowledge it existed. Fast forward to the First World War. An ocean away, American soldiers are fighting in the trenches of France, and back home, a new kind of tension is rising. A war within the war. Black soldiers, serving a country that still refused to treat them as full citizens, are watching their own government undermine them even as they fight and die overseas. One black soldier, stationed far from home, does something remarkably bold. He writes an open letter, publishes it in a Memphis newspaper, directly addressing his state's draft board, and in that letter, he calls them out. Low-down motherfuckers, he writes, whose injustice back home would not be forgotten once the war ended. For using that word, in print, against the men who held power over his life and his family's future, he was court-martialed, sentenced to 10 years of hard labor, 10 years, for a word, not for desertion, not for violence, for language. This moment tells you almost everything about what this word meant in the early 20th century. It wasn't just profanity. It was a direct challenge to authority, sharp enough that the American military legal system felt compelled to crush the man who used it. A word that dangerous doesn't disappear. It goes underground, and underground is exactly where it thrived next. The word didn't die in that courtroom or that court-martial. It migrated into barracks, into ports, into the tight, coded language of men living and fighting together under extraordinary pressure. By the time the world plunged into its second Great War, Motherf had picked up a second meaning, running parallel to the first. It wasn't only an insult hurled at a person anymore, it became a description of a situation, a jammed rifle, an impossible order, a brutal stretch of combat with no end in sight. Soldiers started calling difficult, oppressive, miserable circumstances Motherf. The linguistic cousin of pain in the ass, but heavier, angrier, soaked in genuine exhaustion. Picture a mess hall at 2 a.m., men who haven't slept in 2 days, complaining not about a person, but about the war itself, the mud, the cold, the whole rotten situation. And one word carrying all of that weight at once. This is the moment the word stops being purely an attack on someone's mother and starts becoming something far more flexible, a pressure valve, a way to name suffering out loud. And once a word can describe suffering, it's only a matter of time before it starts describing the opposite, because the same intensity that makes something unbearable can just as easily make something extraordinary. Now picture somewhere completely different. Not a battlefield, a basement jazz club, low light, cigarette smoke curling under a single spotlight, a saxophone player mid-solo, pushing notes further than anyone in the room thought possible. It's the late 1940s and 1950s, and in Black American musical spaces, jazz clubs, blues halls, backstage green rooms, the word is undergoing its most radical transformation yet. Musicians start using it not as an insult, but as the highest compliment imaginable. A player who could do things on his instrument that defied explanation wasn't just good. He was a bad motherfucker. Notice what's happening here. The word hasn't gotten softer. It's just as intense, just as loaded, just as forbidden to say in polite company. But intensity is exactly what's being repurposed. In a culture built on virtuosity, on pushing sound past its limits, this was the only word extreme enough to match the feeling in the room when a musician did something impossible. This is the true turning point in the story. Before this, the word only meant contempt. After this, in certain rooms, at certain hours, among certain people, it could also mean genius. By the early 1960s, this word was still officially unspeakable in mainstream American life, which is exactly why one comedian decided to speak it deliberately from a stage, in front of an audience, and, eventually, in front of the American legal system. Lenny Bruce built his career on saying the things everyone thought, but no one printed. And this word became one of his signature detonations. In 1964, he was arrested for obscenity after a nightclub performance in New York, and the trial that followed became a genuine cultural battleground over where the line of acceptable speech actually sat. Witnesses were called. A minister was asked under oath whether an ordinary, unsophisticated listener might actually believe the word had something to do with mothers and sexual intercourse. He said no, it didn't register that way at all. A Newsweek drama critic testified something similar, that in common usage, it simply didn't carry that literal accusation anymore. And most strikingly, a journalist who covered show business testified that among certain performers and insiders, the word could even function as a term of endearment. Lenny Bruce would eventually be convicted, sentenced to a workhouse, and would spend the rest of his short life fighting the verdict. He never lived to see it overturned, but he had already done something permanent. He had forced a courtroom under oath to publicly wrestle with what this word actually meant in 1964 America. And their own witnesses admitted it wasn't about incest anymore. It was about intensity. Here's where the story gets complicated, and where we need to be careful, because a powerful piece of folklore attaches itself to this word, and it deserves honest scrutiny. A popular theory holds that motherf originated during American slavery, used by enslaved people to describe white slave owners who raped enslaved women, fracturing black families by force, and that the word doubled as a coded way to avoid acknowledging a slave master as one's own father, in cases where that horrifying reality applied. It is a devastating, plausible-sounding story. It fits the darkest chapter of American history perfectly, and it has been repeated for decades. But when historians and lexicographers actually went looking for evidence, they came up empty. Jesse Sheedlower, an editor-at-large for the Oxford English Dictionary and the author of an authoritative history of the word, has stated plainly that there is no documented evidence connecting the term to slavery, and that this kind of folk etymology, however emotionally resonant, doesn't hold up against the written record. The earliest recorded uses we actually have, the 1889 Texas trial, the WWI Soldier's Letter, come decades after slavery's legal end, from entirely different contexts. That doesn't mean the pain the folklore describes wasn't real. It absolutely was. It just means the word itself likely wasn't born there, which raises the more interesting question: why does this origin story feel so right to so many people, even without documentation? Perhaps because the word has always carried the DNA of power, control, and violation, regardless of which era first spoke it aloud. The meaning didn't need slavery to be true. The word was always built to carry exactly that weight. By the late 1960s and into the 1970s, America itself was cracking open. Civil rights, black power, Vietnam, a generation refusing to whisper anymore. And this word rode straight through the center of it. In black political and cultural spaces, it stopped being taboo, slang whispered in back rooms, and became a tool of defiance, spoken loudly, publicly, unapologetically. A rejection of the polite, sanitized language white American institutions had always demanded from black Americans. Then, Hollywood caught up. The blaxploitation film era exploded onto screens. Tough, stylish, unapologetic black heroes who talked exactly like the streets they came from. And this word became part of their vocabulary, their swagger, their refusal to soften themselves for anyone. Around the same time, a young stand-up comedian named Richard Pryor was rebuilding his entire comedic identity from the ground up, walking away from the clean, network-friendly material that had made him famous, and speaking instead in the raw, unfiltered voice of the neighborhoods he grew up in. His albums didn't just use the word, they were built around the rhythm of it, the way it could land as rage, as comedy, as tenderness, sometimes all in the same sentence. He would eventually win a Grammy for one of those very albums. A word that had once ended in a 10-year prison sentence for a soldier was now winning the recording industry's highest honor. Then came a comedian who made this word, and 6 others just like it, the center of a nationwide legal argument all over again. George Carlin's routine, 7 words you can never say on television, placed this word directly at the heart of America's biggest ongoing fight over free speech and broadcast decency. In 1972, performing that very routine at a festival in Milwaukee, Carlin was arrested. The case eventually helped shape decades of American broadcasting law. A comedian, a list of forbidden words, and a legal system forced, again, to define exactly how dangerous language could be before the government stepped in. It's almost hard to believe now, in an era of unfiltered internet content, that a stand-up comedian could be handcuffed for saying a word out loud on a stage. But that's precisely how much cultural gravity this word still carried in the early 1970s. Every decade so far had added a new layer to it. Legal danger in the 1880s, military punishment in the 1910s, musical reverence in the 1950s, obscenity trials in the 1960s, and now, in the 1970s, a full-blown national conversation about broadcast decency itself. The word wasn't just surviving, it was accumulating history, layer over layer, like sediment. By the 1980s and into the 1990s, a new sound was rising out of the Bronx, out of Compton, out of Brooklyn. Hip-hop was becoming the dominant voice of a generation, and this word found its most natural home yet. In rap, Motherf wasn't a slip or an outburst. It was a tool of precision, used for menace, for humor, for bragging rights, for grief, sometimes stitched into a single verse, doing 3 different jobs at once. Groups built entire artistic identities around unfiltered, confrontational language, refusing to censor themselves for radio programmers or parents' groups, even as the music industry slapped warning labels on their album covers in response. Those warning stickers, black and white, blunt, impossible to miss, became almost a badge of authenticity rather than a deterrent. If your album needed one, it meant you were telling the truth as your audience understood it. And the word rode straight through all of it, reshaped again, now carrying the weight of a whole genre's defiance against an industry and a culture that wanted it quieter, safer, more palatable. It refused, and an entire generation of listeners refused right alongside it. Then, in 1994, this word walked straight into the American mainstream through the unlikeliest of doors. A Quentin Tarantino screenplay, and an actor named Samuel L. Jackson delivering it with a rhythm and precision that turned it into something close to poetry. Pulp Fiction didn't just use the word. It weaponized it, stylized it, made it cinematic. Dialogue crackling with it in ways that critics and audiences alike couldn't stop talking about. Jackson would go on to use the word so often, in so many films, with such unmistakable command that it became genuinely associated with his screen persona, an actor whose delivery of 6 specific letters could make an entire theater lean forward in their seats. This is worth sitting with for a second. A word that had once been too dangerous to print fully in a murder trial transcript, too dangerous to say on a public stage without risking arrest, was now nominated for awards, quoted at dinner parties, printed fully, unapologetically, in film magazines, and screenplay collections sold in ordinary bookstores. The taboo hadn't vanished, but it had, unmistakably, moved. So, where does that leave the word today? Everywhere and nowhere fixed. It can still detonate a room if aimed at the wrong person in the wrong context. It has not lost its capacity to wound, to threaten, to insult with real force. And in the very same breath, among friends, in music, in comedy, in casual conversation, it can mean the exact opposite. Admiration, camaraderie, even affection. Few words in the English language carry that much range. Fewer still have the paper trail to prove it. A murder trial, a court-martial, an obscenity conviction, a broadcast decency case, a Grammy Award, an Oscar-nominated screenplay. One word, 137 years, and counting. Think about what we just walked through. A word that got a man killed in 1889. A word that sent a soldier to 10 years of hard labor for daring to speak it to power. A word that got a comedian arrested on an American stage, twice, a decade apart. A word that musicians turned into the highest praise they had. A word that a legal system spent decades trying to define, contain, and ultimately failed to erase. And yet, despite courtrooms, censorship, court-martials, and arrests, the word survived, not because anyone protected it, because generation after generation of people who had almost nothing else that was fully theirs decided this word would be. History rarely announces its most important battles in advance. Sometimes they're fought over 6 letters, in a Texas courtroom nobody remembers, by people whose names barely survived the record, but the word did. And it's still being reshaped today, right now, in conversations happening as you watch this. If this kind of hidden history fascinates you, The stories buried inside the words we use every single day. Make sure you're subscribed, because there are dozens more of these waiting to be uncovered. And I want to know from you, what word, place, or forgotten piece of history should we dig into next? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one.